Meeting to order at this time. At this time, I will call the meeting to order. I will call the meeting of the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee to order. And the time is 4:09. Okay, roll call.
Ms. Emerald?
Here.
Ms. Cepeda Lopez?
Lopez Cepeda.
Lopez Cepeda, see, I'm very
Here.
dyslexic, sorry. Dr. Geary?
Here.
And I am your Ms. Carbuccia.
Okay. B, public communication of posted items, President's statement. This is the point on the agenda where members of the public may address the committee on the items before the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee. Any public comments shall be limited to 3 minutes each. Any speakers?
Kelly, anyone on the line?
No, nobody on the line. Thank you.
We have no speakers. Items for discussion. C1, Review Committee, Purpose and History. Dr. Aguirre?
Thank you, Trustee Lopez Cepeda. So on this item, we wanted to bring forward some history and context of the work of the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee. As the name implies, being an ad hoc committee, it's taken up from time to time, depending on whether there are issues of relevance or not. And so in your binders, you will see information around some of the activities of this committee. In the past, it's been somewhat informal, depending on whether or not there are important legislative matters. As you can see, this work became particularly of interest and pertinent during COVID. There was a lot of governmental activity that was occurring both at the state and federal level. And so that's when you can see things such as the legislative platform that were adopted. Prior to that, there's been some actions and activity that was adopted by this committee. I'll ask Ms. Carbuccia to walk us through this history, but the broader point being that this really is a subcommittee where we can process some areas of interest in terms of potential for legislative advocacy. We have Mr. Kevin Gordon from Capital Advisors, and they've been advising us for the past year and a half. And he's based in Sacramento and really helps us connect with both state and federal legislators as well as legislation. And so he's a great resource and really helps facilitate some of the work of this ad hoc subcommittee. So with that, I'll ask Ms. Carbuccia to move forward and present some of the context and history of this subcommittee. Ms. Carbuccia.
Perfect, thank you. So back in February of 2018, the board, as part of its governance process, decided that one of their key actions they were interested in was establishing an advocacy plan. And so in May of 2018, the board came together at a regular board meeting. For your knowledge, if you flip to tab 3, there's a list of all of the actions, and we'll send it to you electronically because it also has a link to every of the attached items, but those are also in your binder. So at that board meeting, they established the purposes of establishing a legislative committee with the purposes of doing an advocacy plan, building community awareness of schools' needs, scheduling lobby visits specifically around the legislature's budget schedule, really focused more at that time on the state level, inviting our stakeholders to participate in our lobbying efforts, meeting with legislators. So the first legislative committee members were Mr. Solis and Ms. Hall. The first ad hoc committee was held in August 20th of 2018. And at the time, it was really to present a purpose, a timeline, some parameters with the goal of actively participating in CSBA's lobbying efforts. A second meeting was held October 23rd, 2018, to really provide an update on the status of legislation pertinent to the district. CSBA came and spoke to us to see what we wanted to support, and a date was tentatively held for a joint board meeting with our feeder districts to have some conversations about building a collective legislative platform. Another, at that point, that was our last meeting of the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee. There was still actions that did go on. We attempted to schedule some meetings at other times. But really, it wasn't until 2021 that we really started to bring it more to a focused forefront. Until that point, for example, during a number of those years, I served as AXA's legislative vice president and put together our visits within the AXA district. Mr. Span, who is in the room, for those of you that don't know, Mr. Span is very, very active within the school nutrition world, both at the state and the federal level, participating in advocacy. And Dr. Sockhild is very active in forums like CASBO to be involved. So individually, staff worked, but we came really back together under Dr. Aguirre's direction to try to start really being on the forefront of trying to make those visits to legislators, working. One of the major things we did was we brought forward a contract with Capital Advisors to serve as our state and federal advocates and really assist us in getting our word out and getting our needs out. And from there, followed up on a legislative platform, which you're going to see in a minute, that was adopted in December of 2021. We did a lot of virtual visits, especially during COVID at the statewide level that Mrs. Hall, Mr. Solis, we did it with CSBA, we did it with AXA, we did them on our own with the coordination of Capital Advisors. And then we also have now gone to something called Coast to Coast, which is a CSBA AXA DC trip where we advocate. It's a little bit of a different environment when we were advocating for education, whereas it's a little more defensive now. And that was in April of 2022. So there's been a number of actions that we've taken until this point, until the board under Jarl's leadership have asked for there to be an advocacy committee again. So that's really the history of where we've been. For that item, Moises, unless there's anything else you want to add on that one? Okay.
Okay. So moving on to item C2, legislative update, new laws and pending legislation.
So what you will see in your binder is a couple of documents. So you will see a document that when we talk about legislation, we're always looking back at the laws that were just passed and signed into law that we now have to implement. And we're looking forward to the legislative advocacy proposals that we want to get changed or we want to defeat. And so this year, there was a large document under tab 4 that we provided you that was put together by our friends at Capital Advisors to really summarize every major area of law that had some changes. The ones I probably want to focus on the most, just to give you a quick overview, there were some new COVID requirements that passed. Not surprisingly, new reporting parameters and permissions. There were some laws related to excused absences and what we talk about for students, both if they, from an illness perspective, we now can use mental health and mental health issues in particular as excused absences. We can use cultural celebrations as an excused absence, and that's within culture, within religion. We also now may, upon advance notice, if a student is going to attend a political event or a civic event, including a protest, students, if they give us the notice, are able to have those be considered an advance or an absence. On the other side, we have some heightened mandating reporting requirements that now require that cause, should we not report, higher felony level and different restrictions. We also have some new time limits for how long sexual assault cases may have for statute of limitations. We have some overpayment provisions, so there's now requirements that we provide to staff notice that if they're overpaid, how we will pay them back. They get a couple of options before the automatic default is a direct withdrawal from their paycheck. And there's also, not surprisingly, some new restrictions related to CalSTRS and how we report, in particular will impact bargaining, how we report a change in income. And then CalSTRS says, oh, you didn't report it right. And what does that mean for the fees and the penalties that hit employers, but at the same point, how do you make employees whole? So that is, there's another chunk of Buy America food bills that are out there that are in our area. So those are, an idea of some of them. And in a minute, I'll turn it over to Kevin. I know that Eric, you had some laws that in particular pass you. Would you like to just, or not you personally, but your work for the district, you want to talk a little bit about some of the laws that have come into play in the last couple of months that impact your area?
Yes, thank you very much for including me in on this group. One area that is really important to us in the state of California right now is SB 490. And SB 490 is just an extension of the Buy American Act that the USDA had already put in place for school nutrition departments to purchase agriculture that was grown in the United States. What the SB 490 does is kind of takes that a little bit further to limit it to only 5% of any items outside of California. It must meet the bid limit for that 5% threshold before we can use any items outside of California. And for us, that's specifically speaking to items like pineapples, bananas, and things that are not normally grown in the United States. But we seasonally, from time to time, because of just the seasonality of where things grow in the country that we use in our program, some of those are actually grown outside of the country. So we have already had to be aware of that. So for us in nutrition services, the key part of 490 that we were concerned about is that if we were to use any other products outside of the state of California, because it's really more strictly specifying that we must buy California first, it requires us to only use a product that is 25% more than, or excuse me, less than what we would use in our bids. And so for us, the concern is nutrition services departments is that provides an unfunded opportunity for prices to raise for us. That's unfunded up to that 24.99%. Because the 25% is the threshold. So we are continuing to offer comments on that particular bill. A couple other things that are happening with us right now is that we are looking at the kitchen infrastructure and training funds that are provided for us through USDA and CDE. And what those funds are doing for us in 2022 is providing monies for us to purchase kitchen infrastructure, for us to be able to buy new equipment to use in our kitchens as we deal with providing meals for all at no cost. And so what we are concerned with on that level is that the third part of the money that we opt in is a 40% must be freshly prepared threshold that districts, if they want that extra pot of funding, would need to opt into. We're just working with the CDE on some additional definitions so that we are able to understand what that means so that more districts can apply for those funds. On a national level, the USDA just released on Friday the proposed new rule guidelines to align the nutrition services menu planning to be more in line with the dietary guidelines for America. And so there are a couple of areas in which they're going to have some impacts for us, which will be grains and what type of grains we're able to use for breakfast, how we would be able to incorporate whole grains and culturally relevant foods into our menu planning. There's a little bit of a delayed phase-in of sodium, which is actually a good thing for us. And then we're going to also be looking at sugar and how sugar is used in the meal programs for breakfast and lunch. And so we're just, again, in my role as the PPNL, so as a Public Policy and Legislation Committee for the state of California. So this year I've been lucky enough to be chosen as a chair. So I'll be representing the interests of all nutrition services departments in the state of California, in Sacramento, and also in Washington, D.C. as part of our annual legislative action conferences. So that's the updates that I have right now for you.
And at this point, I'm going to ask Kevin. Kevin, if you could, you get to back clean up. So did I miss anything on the laws that passed that were important that you want to raise? And then if not, do you want to start talking a little bit about what you're seeing right now for coming up this year in your fancy crystal ball?
Look on her box.
Kevin, are you there?
I said he's here.
He says he's there. He may have trouble. Is he?
Oh, click on the box where the person is, and go up to the top where you have the two double lines. No, go to the Rachel box, and
Two double
the
lines?
two double lines.
Okay.
There he is.
Kevin, can you hear us? Can you unmute Kevin? See how it says?
I could hear you ask that. And Kelly, I think, are you closest to wherever the speaker is?
Yes,
Yeah, you're like crystal clear.
okay.
The rest is totally garbled.
Okay, so I'll be loud. Can you hear me now, Kevin?
Yeah.
So, anything I missed, which you might not know because you couldn't hear, and then can you give us your crystal ball for what you see pending statewide and federally right now from a legislative perspective?
Yeah, and you guys can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So if I think I heard you clearly, you're ready for me to sort of give a little bit of ledge background, what's going on now, or?
Yes, that'd be great. And then also for
Okay,
next
cool.
year.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the work that obviously we've started out doing. And, we obviously, the goal is to try to take it to another level. So we're going to give you a little bit of legislative background on what's going on right now in the legislature. And it really is amazing how different the issues are from one year to the next. Some of them are the same, but there's a lot of different issues. And partly it's just because of the success that we've helped to impart to the legislature. So, the current situation right now, and I'm not sure, one of the things that we've enjoyed over the last few years is Sweetwater's always sent a really good delegation, including members of the board, to the budget workshops that we do that are free. We have them at the County Office of Education. Not sure if you guys were able to attend, but it's not that big of a deal because you own the source, me, so we can give you in-person kind of background what's going on. But it is a good thing to go to, and sometimes even with our labor partners to attend as well. But the bottom line, couple of things that are going on is that, number one, obviously fiscal, with regard to the big fiscal constraints the state is having with regard to revenue, a $30 billion problem over a 3-year period. And when I say 3-year period, I'm talking about last year, current year, and next year. And the way the governor deals with it is he basically says, look, the math works out so that we can actually manage a lot of the problem because we've been spending one-time money on school districts that was actually ongoing money in the past. Then once we hit a brick wall, the revenue starts coming, it stops coming in as well as it had before, then we just don't allocate it for new one-time causes. We just stop spending that money. And by not allocating money to new ongoing things, he's able to protect all of the base investments, the base level investments, the ongoing funding that were put into the budget just last summer. So there's billions in brand new programs, a lot of which we at Sweetwater are eligible to do pretty well on because they are predicated on a lot of the variables that we do well with: poverty, English language learners, foster youth, across those unduplicated count issues, as well as some of the targeted money that the governor's got in the budget in a couple of key places. So he protects all of those. And then on top of that is pledging to protect a COLA that will be over 8% next year for the year that starts July 1. That'll be the largest COLA we've ever had in my career over, a couple of decades here, almost 3 decades. And so that's a really big demarcation point in terms of overall revenue situation. So it sounds bad, but the governor's got it handled because of some of these nuances. Now, if things actually get worse in terms of the economy, the governor and legislature have a place to go for that too, which is that we've got this extraordinary pot of money, $8.5 billion, which stands as a rainy day fund just for Prop 98. We'll be able to dip in that if anything happens where the amount of revenue drops so much that we cannot maintain everything the governor invested in last year as ongoing, plus a COLA. In those circumstances, you get to dip into the rainy day fund. So that's what I'm suspecting we may need to do by May. We'll see what happens. But the May revision, which happens obviously every May, when we get the governor's updated numbers on his overall budget forecast, will be when, in fact, we have to deal with the potential of other budget types of issues that might come along, including some of these solutions that I think are going to be really workable. And so one of the things that you look at when you look at our platform that we had a year ago, it talked about base funding. Well, we got significant base funding beyond COLA. It ended up being the 6.56% COLA plus the 6.7% base increase to LCFF, which is something we've been advocating for. That was a 13.6% increase. You add an 8.1% COLA, probably that's even conservative, next year, and you have the base investments that we've been advocating that are part of the platform that we have. The other things that I would look for, there were a number of issues that the governor got to, whether it was transportation or special ed and the expanded learning opportunity program, a number of other things that align to the priorities of the district that the governor hit. Some of the things we're going to be looking at as we start talking about a platform for next year, and I know this is another part of our agenda, will be the things that cover be the implementation that are kind of hard to get through, an overly heavy burden on reports and bureaucracy, that kind of thing. Those are going to be some of the issues that we're going to have to deal with that are complicated. So there's that. And then also on other issues that definitely concern us, because we have eligibility for new construction and modernization, is going to be the degree to which we get a school bond measure passed this year for the March 2024 ballot. So that's going to be on the radar screen of something that we're going to want to do. And so there are two bills that have been introduced that deal with bond measures. And basically, they're very similar. The big distinction between the bills is that Senator Steve Glazier, who's the sponsor of SB 28, would also cover CSU and UC. The legislation by Elmer Tsushi, who is the chair of the Assembly Ed Committee, brand new chair of the Assembly Ed Committee, would not do CSU and UC. And the reason for not doing it is because every time we go up for a ballot measure like this, we always see in the polling that we do actually better, ironically, when we do not include CSU and UC. So there'll be that debate hashed out again, once again. One of the issues that's in the Glazier bill that's something to watch for are reforms generally that give preference to districts that have higher numbers of kids in poverty. Obviously something that we would benefit by in Sweetwater. So as we get further along the path here, because those bills were just introduced, and we see what develops with regard to the negotiation over the content of those bills, we'll keep you guys apprised. But my recommendation would be that we be supportive of the idea of a bond measure, a statewide bond measure, which then matches against any of the resources that we put up here in Sweetwater. So those are some of the key issues. Another major issue in the governor's budget will be reform to the LCAP and accountability sort of structure. We're going to have to watch that very carefully. I think people have gotten really frustrated that what was supposed to be a readable, very transparent and accessible LCAP has gotten out of control because the legislature keeps mandating more and more things that would go in it, making this thing really, really huge and really hard for your average parent or community member to access. So it's going to have to be a balance between wanting to make sure we're holding accountable districts for the extra money that we get who generate those dollars in concentration grant, and the notion of us having a report that's ridiculously large that nobody can read. So that debate starts right away as well. And then finally, there's a new sort of proposal the governor has, which we call the equity multiplier. It's $300 million. It's actually intended to try to help lift up the performance of African American kids because they're consistently the lowest performing subgroup when we look at assessments. And Dr. Akila Weber from San Diego is the author of that effort. And she did a compromise with the governor, which was to hold back a bill she had last year in trade for doing something in the budget now. The governor's done that. The problem with the African American community is they don't believe this really gets to the African American community to the degree that they really want it targeted. And it's because the criteria on it is all predicated on poverty. Very high levels of poverty, to be sure, but that's not the same as doing the lowest performing subgroup, which would much more target in a targeted way identify African American students. So that's going to be really the objective, I think. When we look at the negotiation over this, most legislators are going to do a data run. They're going to look at how well or not well their own districts do, and they're going to say, they're not real crazy about the fact that out of 600 districts, 600 school sites that have been identified statewide, 400 of them are in LA. And so people are a little grumpy about that. But again, to me, it's about where are the kids? The other thing is that we know the formula that the governor put out is one that would actually benefit Sweetwater. To the degree that they change it to lowest performing subgroup, it'll probably diminish the amount of benefit that we're going to get. But again, it's about the legislature targeting it to make sure it gets to the students that they're intending to lift. If you look at LCFF, which is targeted toward, English language learners and kids in poverty, the one thing we do miss is that lowest performing subgroup. So there'll be a lot of debate about that as we go forward. So that's kind of just a snapshot. I hope I didn't take too much time, but I want to see if you guys have any questions.
Any questions, comments?
Kelly, you could repeat them because, again, once you get very far away from where you're at, it's real hard to hear.
Good, the microphone is on. Hi there, Kevin. My name is Marty Emerald, one of the newly elected trustees here on the board. I've got a couple of questions for you. On that SB 28 you were talking about, that would be the statewide bond. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the Glazier bill.
The Glazier bill. Is that with a Z or an S? A Z,
actually.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Steve Glazier, GLAs. You might remember, Steve, because I know you got sort of a good pulse on what happens at the Capitol, but Steve was Jerry Brown's chief political strategist and spent a lot of time in the governor's office, including walking the dog. I saw him a couple times walking the governor's dog.
Well, that's good for him. He needs the exercise with that kind of a stressful gig, Hey, here in the Sweetwater area, I know that developers over the years have set aside considerable open property for an education, a facility of higher education. UC or a San Diego State or maybe a private thing. And we really want to see that happen with this SB 28 and suggestion that funds may be used statewide for higher education. How might we position ourselves here in Sweetwater to perhaps open a door and get some conversation going that would benefit us with that kind of a long-term goal?
Did you hear it, Kevin?
Yeah, I heard that was perfect. The CSU, San Diego State and UC San Diego are going to love hearing you say that because they want allies in K-12. Mm-hmm. To the extent that you guys on the board carve that out as a priority to say, look, we're more in favor of the Glazier bill. And again, the other reason why you actually should be more in favor of the Glazier bill is because the Glazier bill is going to lean more toward our district when it comes to starting to look at the distribution of facility funding predicated on the degree to which you do or don't have poverty. That is not in the Martsucci bill. So I think that for a couple of reasons, and I did not know that one, which is a good one, if there's a rationale, there's no question about it that if you ended up with a Martsucci bill that had no higher ed component, it's going to make the potential of that project ever happening a lot dimmer. with obviously the infusion of the kind of money Glazier's talking about, which is $15.5 billion. There's going to be money in there to do projects like what you're talking about, and like in all likelihood. So that's exciting that you guys have a sense of something that's going on locally that could benefit from that bond measure.
Well, so we should have more talks about this. And just so you know, I'm not a newcomer to this issue. Back in '08, Marty Block, you remember Marty Block, who was in the
Marty, super
legislature.
well.
He and I campaigned a lot together, and this was an issue that we need to expand access to higher education, especially in areas of our county that are bereft. And we're still sitting in the same position all these years later. We really need to, I think, get serious about this. I have another question for you. And I understand this is a statewide issue, not just folks here in Sweetwater. Cafeteria workers with no health insurance. I'm told that, well, this is a set budget item, not just here, but probably in other districts around the state. And how do we build some momentum to get health insurance for these employees who are so crucial to the operation here? I mean, we're still engaged in a pandemic, whether or not some electeds like to say the emergency's over. And we know the cause. It's pathogens being passed from one person to another. If we have cafeteria workers preparing food, serving food, and I understand to about 1 million people every year, 1 million meals a year, we run the risk of pathogens being passed. And don't we need to take a further step to make sure that these workers can have access to health care by having some kind of a policy? Do you know if anything else is happening on the statewide level with this issue? And then I'll refer here to Dr. Aguirre, perhaps, to comment further on what is happening here in our district that may help to move the dime. Back to you.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And I'm not particularly aware of anything that's moving at the moment, but again, the disposition of this legislature is going to be sort of our ripest opportunity to address that issue. Obviously, sort of the main question is, what are the costs that are involved, and how do we make that kind of thing happen? I'll tell you that one of the sort of advantageous sort of aspects about our work in this area is that we represent the California School Nutrition Association, which are the school nutrition directors everywhere. And you can imagine how excited we've been by the policy changes by the legislature and the governor that have been really unwilling to fund child nutrition programs adequately for years. And now we're finally getting appropriate investments in child nutrition in the school lunch program, the universal meal program. But it is kind of interesting. There was a bill passed last year that did require that we have all of our produce and vegetables, fruits, vegetables, and nuts, everything that you buy that would be put on a child's plate had to be sort of a Buy America policy. So you guys could probably relate to this, that when tomatoes or other kind of produce that are maybe produced in Mexico so close by, that are actually in season, ready to go. It's not even an issue of being cost effective. It's about the freshest vegetables of a certain type being available, that we are now prohibited from being able to buy those products unless there's a margin. Basically, the margin is, I think it's 24 or 27%. As long as it's only 24 to 27% higher, we cannot buy it. It's only if it's above that, which the irony of that is that it had the effect of inflating some of the prices that we have. That is not covered in the universal meal program, and neither are any other program cost increases. What we would want to do is try to pursue the idea that we make sure that all of our cafeteria workers, along with all of our classified staff, have the kind of benefits and compensation packages that treat them, on par with what we're going to need. As well as I'm sure I do, that one of the biggest single problems we have in public education today is staffing shortage. And that's driven in part by we've got a lot of competitors for the labor market. And if we don't do something about that, what we're doing in terms of compensation and benefits to attract them, we're going to come up shorthanded. So all of that deserves a lot. I've not seen anything in the hopper so far legislatively, but it's one of those things we can keep our eye out for and keep you guys apprised of it.
Is that something that you and your associates might want to brainstorm?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really would like to kind of dig into it a little bit more, because the
Okay.
other issue is, and we work real closely with CSCA and SCIU at the state level, as you probably are aware, they're not wild about us trying to do differential pay, even though sometimes I think it's important to attract workers in certain areas. They're not crazy about it, so we've never kind of stuck our finger in that hornet's nest. So they tend to want to be advocates for overall healthcare compensation, those kinds of issues for all their classified employees, not just whether it's school bus drivers or nutrition employees, you know, that kind of a thing. But we're very, very down for having that conversation to discuss further about what are the kinds of things that we could support as a district that could also earn the support of organized labor. Because in this legislature, we will be definitely swimming upstream if we're going to try to tackle legislation that we don't try to get their support on. And I would think that the premise of what you're talking about, they would be supportive of. They just wouldn't want to limit it to cafeteria workers.
And if I may, Trustee Emerald, so this is one of those areas where there's significant overlap between the federal government, state government, and here locally, where we feel the impacts most acutely. So at the federal level, the USDA has a limit on what we call the fund reimbursement. So the cafeterias are funded through a specific fund, Fund 14, out of the budget. It's a categorical in essence. So they have what we call a reimbursement limit, where they reimburse the amounts in terms of a per meal limit. And what that does is it artificially limits our ability to be able to find local solutions, such as providing different types of healthcare options, because of the fact that we want to ensure that this fund, the cafeteria fund, remains solvent. And so we're kind of caught in a little bit of a catch-22, where from the federal and state, really it's from the federal level, but state level they implement via the California Department of Education, we have a limit. So we can only reimburse up to a certain limit, and beyond that, we have to absorb it. And so that causes us an inability to really be able to invest the amounts that we would like to without putting in jeopardy the well-being of the fund, the cafeteria fund. So that's where there's some crosswinds, and I think there might be some area that's ripe for advocacy for us to engage at the federal level and perhaps at the state, but probably more at the federal, to have that increase in terms of the amount that we can claim for reimbursement. This is a conversation we've had now. There was an additional conversation that happened with our employees who came to a board meeting, so we have continued to problem solve, see if there's some type of creative solution we can find locally. But again, ultimately, I think it comes to this issue of fund reimbursement limit, where the federal government limit through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which operates the program, where they have those limits that don't recognize the difference between operating a program in California versus Tennessee versus Maine. And as you can imagine, there's very different costs of doing business in these states. And so I think that's an area that is ripe for advocacy that at the federal level, because they are the ones who operate the program. And Eric, I don't know if you can elaborate on some of the efforts that are going on through the advocacy groups. And I know that Capital Advisors also supports the work of nutrition service providers, so we can kind of provide some elaboration on that.
Sure. Our advisor is Ms. Leangela Reed through Capital Advisors, and she's been just a wonderful supporter and also a guider of us in how we move forward. But you're correct. Federally, that's where the USDA and the nutrition program actually sits. And so the funding is determined based on.
Was that a question you put to me, Moises?
No, I think that was me, Kevin.
Kevin, I put the question to Eric. Yeah, it's about the fund reimbursement limit, and that would probably be a federal question in terms of opportunity for advocacy with USDA, if it's a rulemaking process, or if it's legislation, but it may be at the rulemaking procedure. But I'll ask Eric, and then Kevin, if you're aware of any work in terms of advocacy around the issue of fund reimbursement limits. But I'll ask Eric, and then Kevin.
Great.
Yes, so nationally, SNA, which represents the totality of the states of School Nutrition Association, and California is a member of that national organization. We are having conversations about expanding the reimbursement rate because we do have a lot of unfunded costs that are coming through us through inflation, through prices in steel, fuel, et cetera, that our reimbursement rates, they don't actually capture for us. And so we do have a lot of districts that are not operating in the red. They are struggling, not operating in the black, because they're struggling to make ends meet because they don't get enough money back. And that's nationally, it's not just even here in California. So we are collaborating statewide, state by state, to communicate how to ask for that. And that's something that when we go to LAC, when we go to make our annual trip to DC, those are those are conversations that we have with our federal representatives.
Is it important at all that we have a friend in the U.S. Department of Education, i.e. Cindy Martin? Is it time to start chatting this up with her and some of her associates at the Department of Education?
It's the Department of Education, but I think a little bit more is the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. They're the ones who operate the program. So I think Eric has been working on some of the advocacy, but I think there's definitely the opportunity to engage our federal representatives via our members of the House, as well as our two state senators to engage that. But Kevin, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I want to say, you guys have pretty much already said it, which is, it is one of those sort of things that's in between the feds and the state administering these different programs, with obviously objectives of trying to get to the full funding of the program, offering universal meals, but understanding that the way the rules work can sometimes impede the goals that we have, especially with regard to how we're treating our employees. I would think that, given the fact that I know there's a plan for us to have our own delegation back in DC for the coast to coast trip that CSBA is sponsoring along with AXA, that I don't think it would be too much trouble, and we can definitely put it on one of our objectives, is to meet with the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture who covers food and nutrition. And your team obviously is very well steeped in school nutrition issues, and having participated in LAC and the stuff that goes on probably back in Washington, D.C. as well. We've actually been asked this year, we haven't done federal issues for the CSNA, the School Nutrition Association, for a while. They've been in very capable hands for a long time, but the person that they had running that for them, I think, is retired. So they've actually asked us this year to help set up a couple of meetings. But I would want to try to request a meeting just for us, just for Sweetwater, to get some answers to the unique circumstances that we're talking about. And maybe they can shed some light on what they think it is we need to do. I'll just put a caveat in there. The degree to which this is a regulatory issue and we get regulatory relief is great, because that's the Biden administration, and we're going to have a lot of traction with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to the extent they can do it. But if it takes congressional action, that's a whole nother, can of worms. Because again, I don't know that we're going to have in this coming session the kind of interest in trying to help us with these kinds of issues. It doesn't mean they don't deserve to have a voice, that we give voice to these issues. We're just going to have a harder time if we would involve actual federal legislation. But we'll see what the department can do, the Ag Department can do from a regulatory standpoint. And that's where I think we could probably get some good advice.
Well, and meantime, I think that contacting our congressional delegation, giving them a heads up that this is an issue not just for us, but for schools throughout California and the country, maybe it'll be an issue that they will want to, latch onto and do something with. So is there any problem with just reaching out, making some phone calls, and having some...
And totally agree, like with Sarah Jacobs and,
yeah,
our congressional, absolutely makes sense.
terrific, thank you.
Yep.
Kevin, this is Elba Lopez Cepeda, new trustee. And my question...
Congratulations.
Oh,
Congratulations.
oh, thank you. My question to you is, has California released all of the 2,000 bills that have been sitting on their desk. They're supposed to be released this month, because we're gonna be looking at some of them in, when do I go back? March.
Yes. So what's happened right now is we had a deadline that was a week ago for all lawmakers to get their ideas into basically the office of their attorneys, the legislative council that draft those bills. That's happened. But the actual bill introduction deadline isn't till later this month. I think it's the third week of February. And that's when then we're going to start to see a slew of legislation. So like this rather lengthy report that I know was made available to you guys on what happened in the last session, that is the culmination of bills that, you know, occurred over the last 2 years, basically. I mean, a lot of it was just in the last year, but that, I think it was 54 pages that you had mentioned, Kelly. What we will do as soon as all the legislation has sort of been introduced, we're going to then be identifying what we think are the highest profile items that should come to your attention. We work principally through the superintendent, but I know the superintendent's going to want to utilize you guys as a committee of the board to bounce stuff off of, anything that we want to be particularly activist about. But I think what we're really going to be looking for when we look at legislation is we're going to look at the platform that you guys adopt, which is a broad sort of position statement on your top priorities. And we're going to be looking at legislation to oppose or support based on that lens, that sort of perspective. So, and then that will actually give us license to sort of go out and be real aggressive advocates on any amendments or any little changes that we see that we think are in violation of the principles that you guys have adopted in terms of what your highest priorities are in that platform. And then also obviously pursuing the things that you guys really want to see done.
Does anyone have any other questions?
So is adding health insurance to our legislative priorities, is that something that we could ask the board to add to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that that's one of the, we would consider putting a draft provision into both the state and the federal platform, since it straddles those two, both of those. It's an issue that would go into both.
So I probably would make the suggestion that we modify the bullets that are in the federal to say that we increase the reimbursement of meal amounts so that we can provide a more competitive wage and benefit. Because the last thing, frankly, we really want is the state or the federal government telling us we must provide health insurance and not giving us a funding mechanism. So we don't want a bullet that says provide health insurance. We want a bullet that says provide funding so we can, because right now we're not failing to provide health insurance because we want to. We have used every penny we have in the fund to provide the wages that are currently there.
I think that amendment that you're proposing is right on it's spot on. So thank you very much.
Does that sound okay, Kevin? Something like that?
Absolutely, no, that makes perfect sense.
And that's actually the next item. Do you want to take us to the next item?
Thank you very much.
All right, next item, C3, review the legislative platform and potential revisions.
All right, so I think we've kind of we're getting into this area, and we've already talked about the federal reimbursement for the nutrition services Fund 14. But this is where I'll ask Jenny to kind of go through and lead us in the conversation around revising, updating our legislative platform. And part of the reason that really is helpful to staff is from time to time there might be a call for support, as you might be familiar. And so in order for us to be able to move timely, it's helpful to have a platform as a guide. And so, well, we need support for legislation around facilities or transportation. If we have a guiding set of document, it's a lot easier to move on it rather than waiting to bring the item to the board and have it. If we've kind of in essence, approved that this is our platform, this is what we intend to support, I think it just facilitates the process, and then we can ask for those letters and as trustees, if you have those relationships, which a lot of you do, to engage those to provide that support and that could be a lot more timely. And we have a pre-approved platform because that's like your North Star, your map. So that's generally how I'd like to think of this platform. But Jenny, we can lead us through the conversation.
Sure, and Kevin, I'm going to phone a friend a lot, but in December of 2021, the board approved a platform to go through the year 2023, and we're now looking at updating it. So the major 4 areas for that would be for the federal government, full and fair funding to support special education programs. And there really is a huge disparity right now. Sorry, because we're recording, we need to make sure that all communications can, yeah. So for the full and fair funding for special education, there's some really big areas on maintenance of effort, calculations on the very fact that frankly, the federal government has had us commit to doing work, and they're not funding it even at 40%. And therefore, every single time the district fails because we don't have the money to fund, it comes on us to support. So I think Moises would tell us, and he'll correct me if I say it wrong, $1 in $4 we're spending right now of our general fund is coming out of, is coming specifically for special ed, above and beyond all special ed funds we get. So full and fair funding of special ed is one. The second is student support, mental health and behavioral services, as well as school safety, really looking at childhood trauma, depression, suicidal ideations, really funding, expanding behavioral services for students and coping mechanisms. So there's a number of different programs under there, and that really includes nutritional well-being, including maintaining eligibilities under SNAP, increasing it. Right now, obviously, we have universal meals, but the reimbursement amounts are not where they need to be. Funding social and emotional programs, bipartisan support for DACA in particular was on our platform from last year. The next really was that big school nutrition and federal school meal programs, and really looking at fully funding and implementing universal and frankly elimination of a number of the bureaucratic processes that we go through in filing our documents. This would be where we would add, Ms. Emerald, the bullet related to increasing the reimbursement that we get for meals as well.
Can we draft it now? So it's there and you could take it and reword it legalese?
So right now, what I had was I took the bullet on the front page and I changed it at the end after public school students, and I put and increase the reimbursement of meal amounts so we can provide more competitive wages and benefits. That was my starting sentence. I was gonna see if Eric wanted to give me the real word. There's, I mean, a fancy word for reimbursement of meals, but I don't know what the fancy word is. Reimbursement of meals?
That's the fancy word.
Okay, so that potentially would be the thought. I just didn't know if there was a special term for it. But I want to make, I think that would be how we could explain. And we could competitive wages and benefits, or we could increase recruitment, however we want to go. But I think I think we need to have the wage as well as the benefit as it relates to that. Moises, did you have a different way? So maybe that would be at the moment.
Or recruitment and retainment.
Recruitment and retention? Okay, recruitment, retention, competitive wages and benefits. So we can put those wages and benefits. That would be right now one of the bullets. And then the fourth priority for the feds was investment in broadband for all and E-rate expansion. As we're building nationally the infrastructure to ensure all of our students have access to technology. While we may have provided devices, we're also buying hotspots. We're giving them because many of our communities don't have internet. So right now, those are things, and we know, for example, Congresswoman Jacobs that is one area that she's been working on as well. And I would be remiss to not tell you on that bullet before related to really engaging students, that Congresswoman Jacobs was able to secure us money. I think it's $100,000 in the federal budget this year, specifically around a program we're calling Adulting for Sweetwater. And it really is those life skills of mentorships and more of those project-based pieces. It's a very, very small budget. We obviously asked for a couple $1 million, and we, as part of your federal trip, the federal trip that Dr. Geary will lead, I think that is another place to continue. She's always interested in helping us and putting monies there. And then as it relates to the state legislative priorities, this is, Kevin, where I really want you to jump in because I know we won a couple of these victories. So if you can help me out. So was really protection of ADA loss protection. We were able to
Hey,
get
Jennifer.
Rachel,
I'm
perfect.
Sorry to cut you off. It looks like we lost Kevin really quick, so I don't. Let me see if he maybe lost service or something. Let me try to get him back on. I hate for you to go through all of that and he not be able to hear you.
Okay.
Let me try to get him on. Really
Otherwise,
quick. I
Rachel, I'm going to
apologize.
call you in. You know it. You know what's going to happen.
I know. I'm taking copious notes over here. Oh, one moment. Let me try to get him on.
2-minute break.
Yeah, why don't we're going to take a 2-minute break, and that way anybody can do all the things you want to do for 2 minutes until we get Kevin back.
Great. Thank you so much.
This is the official 2-minute break. Recess. Going to resume.
We're
I'm
going
going
to
to stop the video because my phone keeps. I apologize, you guys. I have 18% battery left.
Sorry, Kevin. So what I was gonna do, if you don't mind, then do you have the platform in front of you for state legislation?
No, but I have a kind of a sense of what it is, and you guys can guide me through it a little bit.
So I
But
was
what I
just
wanna
gonna
talk
read them, and
about-
if you could tell me, if you want to just tell us the wins, because there were a couple things on, in particular, the fiscal resilience and ADA protections and base funding. Do you want to just talk a little bit about those platform areas and how we might want to modify them based on the changes?
Yeah, perfect. So obviously the thing that we won that was so significant was being able to get investments in base funding beyond just COLA. And we did that 6.7% additional funding beyond the COLA. And this was a major issue that I know, Moises, you'll remember that, it had to come from the field or they weren't going to hear it. And I really do think that we ultimately made a difference in this argument, because it was one thing for them to just simply give us the COLA, which they did, but another thing to give us money in the base, not dictated to certain programs. And the governor's basic preference was to send it tied to different kinds of program objectives. And I get it that he wants to get something specific, but the base funding for schools in this state, and particularly we were feeling it a lot in Sweetwater, needed to have some support. So we got that. So the important thing that I would suggest that we do is we need to keep the pressure on base funding being a focal point. Is that, yeah, we're going to probably be eligible for a lot of specialized targeted money, but it does have strings attached. And that to the extent that we can constantly remind the legislature that funding of the base is critical, but I do think so somewhere in the beginning of the platform this year, we've got to acknowledge the significance of what they did do because it was great. So that we don't come across as ingrates, but we basically make the point, this continues to be an ongoing, effort over time to make sure that as we expand resources for schools, that we don't forget about base funding. So that's the way I would go at rewording that when we get you guys a revised draft.
And then Kevin, can you talk just a little bit about the whole loss protection piece we were doing on ADA, where it came out and where you would suggest for this year?
Yeah. And then so on ADA, I mean, we needed two things. We needed a hold harmless for last year because it was still very much impacted by COVID, as they were anticipating going to what we call a 3-year rolling average, which was good too. In state law over the years, the only protection we have when we have a declining enrollment used to be you could get whatever you got in the current year or the prior year. That was it, whichever was better. So they've gone to a 3-year rolling average. That'll definitely have a benefit for us, but it'll be undermined by the continued anomalous kind of downward trend in attendance that we're having. And so we've got to make sure that we're constantly keeping an eye on both. The 3-year rolling average isn't as effective for Sweetwater if we don't get the legislature and the governor to do something affirmative for us with regard to the kind of attendance impact we're continuing to have that we didn't expect to continue to have, it has not returned to what we expected it to be. Yes, we know we're in decline, but these numbers are still further upside down than they should be because of the nuances of the flu and some of the respiratory illnesses that we've seen and lingering COVID infections that continue to exist today. So we were going to want to keep a section that talks about sort of the reality of the attendance world we live in is still not completely solved, and we need their help.
Yeah, and Kevin, if I may, really the way I think about that issue is it gave us, in essence, a fiscal parachute so that we didn't have to face a fiscal cliff. Because at the end of the day, ADA reflects our overall enrollment, and our overall enrollment is declining, and we have commissioned a study that demonstrates we'll continue to further lose in enrollment. And so this ability to average our attendance over 3 years helped. It definitely became kind of a mechanism through which we didn't have to follow a fiscal cliff. However, it's still a parachute and we're still heading downwards. So I think that'll be a continued point of discussion, particularly how it relates to some of the Prop 98 guarantees that are ensconced in the state budgeting process. And
Next bullet.
then how do we ensure that we are keeping our eye on both issues of ADA, which, again, because of the issues that Kevin mentioned, are an issue, as well as enrollment, because that's also continues to be a challenge. And so even though we may be able to have some protection when it comes to average daily attendance, our reality is that we're losing enrollment because of the things we've talked about, the expensive nature of real estate in San Diego County, decrease in birth rates, decrease in immigration rates. So we know what these factors are. So I just wanted to kind of make sure I mentioned that. We need to continue to be very fiscally prudent given the fact that we've been, in essence, afforded a parachute, but we still are heading downward.
And I think the next bullet really was about making sure that we are very protective of the Prop 98 guarantees. Guarantee being a floor, not a ceiling. And so really trying to grow the Prop 98 without having diversion of Prop 98 funds going to non-educational sources. So that's one. The next piece, and it really was talking about pension policy and finance. There is some real changes that have come and are continuing to come with how much a percentage increase both CalSTRS and CalPERS are allowing now on an annual that can go up. And so we have had in some past years pension relief, because every penny that we put into a pension is a penny that we're not able to otherwise spend on supporting students. We're at almost 50% with wages, with benefits on the classified side. They are just skyrocketing. And we absolutely need to protect our pensions, and we need to make sure our employees that have given their lives have the ability to but it can't be on the backs of just us as the district, and we can't push it all off on our employees. This is also the section potentially where how nutrition services pensions are funded and what it looks like. We need to have enough money to actually have folks be able to contribute in a non-specialized pension. Special ed funding, we saw it on federal side, we'll see it on the state side as well. CTE is one that we really have talked about. How do we invest in CTE that's there? CTE really is I think the discussion you guys have had as board, you all have had as board members thus far, is really about how we create pathways, and pathways very much are integrally linked to our CTE staff and what we're able to provide for them, what their rights are, and what we can fund. And I think that's a big piece. And then finally, really was addressing the staff shortage that we've talked about. The way to do that is through recruitment and retention. The way to do that is obviously through wage relief, but it's also through, as we've noted here, the ability to gain subs, how you get emergency subs, how your retirees can come back and for how long, and what that flexibility looks like. And so that is a huge, huge issue for us within that recruitment process. So right now, those are the platform areas. Kevin, are there any areas here that on this second page that you think need to be modified or tweaked based on what you know or wins that we already got before we ask our board members if there's any changes they'd like to see? Did I lose Kevin? You're muted, Kevin.
Yeah, on
Okay,
CTE, for example, first of all, there's going to be lots of little nuanced things that when I put it into the draft that will just beef up some of these things or change them ever so slightly to reflect kind of what, what's already been done, but what needs to still be done. And in CTE, for example, there's going to be legislation that does what we wanted to try to do last year, but we were not successful in doing, and that is to do a greater investment in career tech education into CTIG. And it would take all the money that was put into strong workforce and move it over into CTIG. And that's a lot of sort of acronyms to say that K-12 has always been the appropriate place for us to do career tech education in collaboration with community colleges, not sort of the other way around. So that's what we're trying to work on. But so, and I'll make references to individual bills as we go along. I mean, as I put this draft together for you guys to come back and take a look at. And even if you look at it and you don't, you still see changes or nuances that you want to make different, we can make those changes.
Perfect. So that is right now where we are. Are there any questions or areas that you guys have, you have identified that you're concerned aren't here, or that are here, or that you're double thumbs up versus
I have a question about the CTEG, Career Technical Education Grant. Are there grants available today? How large a pool is it, and how do we, are we receiving those grants here in our district currently?
So the short answer is we are receiving them here in our district. They're called grants, and they're run through the California Department of Education. Some of them may be competitive and some may not. But we definitely are working with both the county office as they implement this and the California Department of Education. So we are recipients of some of this grant funding, and we have been for a period of time. I think for us, we're at a bit of a crossroad in terms of bringing some of the technological advances. And so I've been in conversations with our director of career and technical education around how we can modernize some of the offerings. So for example, when you're looking at automotive technology, how can we start looking at transforming that program to bring more electrification into the process? Because we are all aware that California as a state has a requirement to transition to all electric vehicle fleet by 2035. So those are the types of questions that we are having internally. And then how can they inform as these grants become available and the grant cycles are up to make sure that they're informing the process we can modernize how we implement career technical education with, again, ensuring that we also have a focus on both the college but also the career aspect of college and career technical education. So we do receive grants. I don't have information in front of me in terms of when those cycles are, But we do participate with, again, California Department of Education and the County Office of Ed.
And I think it's actually really interesting. It's a good example, and Kevin mentioned it. Right now, much of this money flows through what's called strong workforce partnership or strong workforce, and it goes to the community college. And there's set money that's set aside for the staffing of it, the community college piece, and then we as districts, ourselves, Coronado, our areas that have high schools, can apply for funding. And we, as Moises says, it's not really a grant, like we get the money, but it isn't controlled by us, unlike the way we do it through our adult education, where we are a consortium with the community college and Coronado to work on it together. So that, I think, is, Kevin, is that kind of what you're referring to, is really us having a seat at the table as opposed to being able to submit an application?
Exactly. I mean, it's just, first of all, I mean, for the first things first, we need to advocate for the fund to be adequate, and it really needs to be larger than it's been in the past by a significant amount. So then that gives all LEAs who are actually willing and ready to run programs access. And that's what we've really run into, is that people really want to see this take off. Well, they've got to put some funding into it. So, and then the great thing is about what we're asking for, we're not asking for the general fund or for Prop 98 to put more money into this with, you know, obviously in a fiscally constrained environment. We know that there's the strong workforce program, that if you just took that money and put it in here, we'd have a really big increase and more LEAs could have access to it. So we're actually not asking them to spend more money, more net funding. We're asking them to combine the dollars that they have in strong workforce over to this program.
Gotcha. So a bigger share of the pie. And where there's,
And a more direct one.
yeah. So,
Exactly.
yeah, we get a little bit more there. And who does, ultimately, who's funding these programs? Is it organized labor, or is it the manufacturers? Is it, I mean, who's part of that pool?
All of the money we're talking about for CTIG comes right out of the Prop 98 guarantee. So it's not an industry. I mean, obviously we got collaborations with industry and higher ed and that sort of thing, but the resources are all Prop 98 dollars right out of the state budget.
Okay, and right now we've got how much in Prop 98 money in California? Do you know?
Say that again.
How much is in that Prop 98 pool of money?
So only 80 billion, well, hold on, it's more than that. Only $108.8 billion.
That's all.
The amount for CTIG is probably around $270–300 million total right now. And we're looking to increase it by another 150 million, roughly.
And when will you do that? Are you preparing some legislation?
That's going to be carried in legislation that has just sort of been agreed to move forward. It's one of those bill ideas that's not in print yet, but we're expecting by the deadline.
So as soon as you have a designation, an AB or an SB
No,
number?
not yet, but we will soon.
You'll get that to us, huh?
17th.
You betcha.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have another question. How can we use community school funding to help us with some of these issues? Where are we on that funding? We're still on the holding?
So that's probably more for me, Kevin. We did apply for the planning grant from the California Department of Education. They have grants for a program called Community Schools. We have not been notified yet whether we are recipients or not. The reality is I think CDEs, pretty much anybody who applies is at least going to be, this is my understanding, is going to be awarded a planning grant. The real work comes in the next phase, which would be the implementation grant. They're called grants, but they're all funded out of the state's budget, which is, you know, all the taxes we all pay. But they are grants, community schools, so they can help with some of these, what we call wraparound services that we're working on, or really kind of community approach to providing services. But so they can help in some aspects. We just want to be cautious when it comes to the issues we've talked about around employee compensation or benefit. But they can definitely be part of the conversation in terms of how we can redirect campuses to be able to provide different types of supports.
Services,
Mhm, and
but
services.
also CTE opportunities and possibly some nutrition reimbursement.
So those are things that we can, again, explore. That is, we've had a preliminary meeting with, that included all of our associations to kind of engage the work, because this work really is intended to be a collaboration. So we're awaiting word on whether we were awarded that planning grant, and once we get there, the next phase is to bring a work group together on actually preparing for us to submit for the implementation grant.
Okay.
And then I don't know if Kevin wants to mention, Kevin, from a statewide perspective, would you happen to know how much funding is going to be made available for the community schools initiative? I know that last year the governor allocated additional funding for that initiative, but would you have a number kind of off the top of your head?
It's something like.
So I know that what the governor had proposed, the governor's not proposing any additional money beyond what was in the Budget Act passed last summer. And the number actually escapes me at the moment. I don't know if that's something that's at your fingertips, Rachel, but I know it's in our slides on what the initiative was. And then remember that that appropriation is a big number, but it's a number that's supposed to also last 7 years. So, and then, you know, when people say, hey, I get the money, it's intended to obviously be probably the longest use of one-time money we've ever seen proposed in a single budget. But the question is, for a lot of people, is you're investing in certain things, but particularly human capital, that, you know, every CBO will tell you, be careful about investing in things that contain ongoing permanent costs. And so we just have to be careful about it, but we also have to be realistic that if we're doing some things that are really crucial to student success and the well-being of our people in our districts, that, you know, it always begs for additional advocacy someday down the road that they continue to invest in those in a more permanent way. So it's got kind of two sides to that, two edges to the argument. You know, one is really be careful about what you invest in long term, which, you know, we believe is important. But the other thing that we think is that to the extent that we can prove we're doing really vital resources that ought to be continued, we can make that argument down the road when the funds begin to, you know, expire. But everybody's got to go into it with their eyes wide open. This is not permanent ongoing money.
Thank you for that clarification, Kevin.
So were there any other areas that you, as board members, had questions on, concerns, areas that you want to potentially make revisions?
On the staffing shortage, CTC had made a change where if you retired, that you could continue working and there would be no penalty on that. And I know that expired, so maybe working towards that.
Kevin, have you heard anything about the expiration of the CTC allowing retirees to come back at a higher threshold or for a longer period of time?
No, but that's another issue that we want them to try to give us greater flexibility on. And again, I think people thought, well, COVID's over. What do you need this for? And we've actually had folks in the administration say that to us. And we've said, no, you're not getting that. One of the single greatest problems that we have right now is public school agencies is staffing and the staffing crisis. So.
Yeah, and Kevin, I'd just like to echo that comment from Trustee Lopez Cepeda. That is something we have fully leveraged in our district, and it would be not a good thing to not have that ability to ensure that those retired administrators who, or other staff who are retired, teachers, counselors, others who are retired, to be able to come in and provide nutrition services as well, to be able to provide substitute services. They might have the ability to come in once, twice, a couple of times a week, but given the overall staffing shortage above and beyond what happened during the pandemic would be extremely beneficial for us. So that can be something within that bullet. I think it gives us the space to advocate for that. They're addressing staffing needs. So I definitely think it's something that in talking to human resources, we have found very beneficial because there's a shortage of staff in the world, it feels like. And to be able to bring individuals who know our district, know the field of education, whether it's certificated or classified. It's really helpful. So we can make that a point of advocacy. Thank you for bringing that up, Trustee Lopez. Cepeda.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good issue.
It's because I live it.
Yes.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? No? Okay. We're going to move to item C4, committee meeting scheduling.
So on this item, we want to kind of do this as a wrap-up. There's two things that we would normally do. The first, we normally are set to meet about quarterly. Doesn't mean we can't bring additional updates, and Kevin can't get those to us. We do normally meet about quarterly, so that's one. And then we normally bring forward a committee report, for lack of a better term, where we put together, here are the major areas we talked about. We're in the middle of reviewing and revising the platform. Here are some areas we have an interest in. Here are some areas of legislation that we may be interested in, based on our conversations. And so I think those are the two really big things from what we took away with from a modification to really increase reimbursement for meals. And one of the things that I know Eric has shared is that we're really going away from the term universal meals and more for meals for all, or free meals for all, as opposed to just given where we are. Oh, Eric.
The term is meals at no cost.
Meals at no cost,
Yes.
as opposed to universal meals. So there's a couple of those, but really in putting the information in there about trying to increase reimbursement so that we can have a more competitive wages, benefits, and recruitment and retention. In particular, building into recruitment and retention, employees as a whole having, for retirees, really trying to ensure that we make the modifications that Kevin's going to bring forward on ADA, while still thanking them for the fact that we're not ungrateful that they did give us increased base funding, but it's really not enough yet. And so, focusing on CTE and pathways, those were the pieces that we had talked about thus far, putting together a small report. So if you're comfortable with it, what we can do is put together a small report for the committee that we would bring forward as an item, an information item only. Not sure Kevin will be ready for us to have an updated platform this month, but definitely next month we would be able to bring that forward as a change in platform. That way, other board members, we can probably when we give our committee report, if they have other ideas, they can share that information with us. And then I just need y'all to look at your calendars and try to have, is this a good standing day and time, since it is a Monday, or kind of what are your thoughts on when you would like to meet? So those are kind of the two biggest issues from there.
Wednesdays and Thursdays I have board meetings, other board
Yeah,
meetings.
so Mondays and Tuesdays are your best, right?
Yes.
Monday's always good for me.
Monday, perfect. So we will get a couple dates out that are roughly within the quarter, and then what we will also try to do is start putting together, as we're working with Kevin, and he's putting together visit schedules virtually as well. I'm really trying to put together the potential of a Sacramento trip for us to hit, to meet our, not hit up our legislators, that didn't sound very nice, right? To meet with our legislators and advocate strongly on our positions, so that we could do that kind of in unison at a better time. I know you guys are gonna be, Dr. Aguirre and Mr. Solis, Mr. Segura are gonna be heading to DC with the CSBA trip, and so I think we wanna make sure that we're following that up as well, with the Sacramento trip and that advocacy point.
I think that's wonderful. One thing I found that's pretty helpful when doing these advocacy meetings is if we can have a one-page
Yep.
kind of leave behind. I don't know if you can coordinate with Kevin, but just something to remind folks. This
Yes.
is what that's always a little something to leave behind.
Yep, we always will have our who we are and a one-pager.
Okay, so that's the literature we're gonna leave behind. And are you going to also develop the script? The mini script?
We will. We normally always, and then we do a pre-meeting where we kind of sit together and we talk about who's going to talk. It really just depends on who of us are gonna go, if we're gonna take any other staff, what are our expert areas? And internally, I think we need to also have some conversations. So in the past, depending on the issue, we've done trips ourselves. And then we've also done trips when we're advocating jointly with CSEA or with CTA on something where we've actually taken we've taken our unions with us, and we all have a different role. And so I think we just need to probably get ourselves a little further along our process to decide, what bills they're running this year, where we have joint advocacy, and where we might not, and make sure that we can go along that route, because I think we obviously, the same months that are big in Sacramento are also very big in bargaining. And so we have a couple of things we're going to be dealing with here at home. So really making those decisions are going to be a little more play it by ear as we get going. As long as there's no offense, nothing with either of you that you would be against us involving stakeholders. That was one of the pre things that was one of the 2018 thoughts, was we would try to, when appropriate, includes our stakeholders.
Most definitely, most definitely.
And may I add that that way we have a broader picture of what it is we want to achieve. It's easy to go in with our eyes focused on a particular prize, but if we don't understand that there are some other perspectives, we're not going to really come away feeling like we've won anything or really moved the bar at all. So thank you for that. And how often do you say you would like to have these subcommittee meetings? And are there some dates coming up where we want to make sure that we get our thoughts out, our questions answered coming up?
So to start with, what we will do is probably within the next week is we'll put together a summary of the meeting, because to meet board agendas, we're going to need to have that put in the agenda, or Deanne will be mad with us. So we will be having those ready. We'll get you those, a draft of that so you can take a gander at it after Dr. Geary and I look at it. So we'll need to get that done in the next week or so. And then both of you, obviously, when that item comes up, while your report will be in the board, you'll be able to speak to, this is what we discussed, here's where we were, just to kind of give it, won't be a voting item, but it would be one where folks could give input and you can share out. So that'll be for this board meeting. At that same time, we'll send you the next couple quarters of possible dates, just so we can get it on your calendars. It's always nice having it on the dance card a little early. And then what we will do, just because Kevin normally gives us this, is we have a slide that we normally use on what's the legislative flow. And then I think we'll also want to potentially look at, what month might we do visits here, what month might, we put those in as well. So we'll try to put together a little calendar of that we would bring to our next meeting. And then obviously individually, if you hear of a bill or we get information, I will just forward it on over to you. Moises and I constantly, and Eric as well, are getting emails on pieces of legislation, and we'll keep you in this loop, not necessarily for you to need to act, because we don't want to act outside of the committee, but just so you are aware and know if things are going to be of interest to you that we can share.
Can I also
Terrific,
bring
thank
in
you.
information?
Yes, please.
Because the week of the 24th, 25th, and 26th, we'll be looking at bills at CTA.
That's not me, I swear. I'm off.
I just turned it up. We'll be looking at the educational bills that are be coming down.
No, I think any information you share, I always like my CTA resources. We will get AXA resources, we'll get some others as well. Anything you want to share of interest, we can take and have those conversations.
Okay.
Yeah, I've found that when we're most successful in our advocacy is when we can really find those points of alignment with our education partners, whether it's CTA, that's the California Teachers Association, whether it's AXA, that's the Association for California School Administrators, CSCA, or Classified Employees, the whole slew of organizations out there. And Kevin's very involved with kind of what's going on at the state level. So where we can find those points of agreement, I think it really magnifies our efforts. So we try to do that, and that's a great point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay, so then we're gonna move to item D, adjournment. Yay. And 5:37.